Welcome to part 3 of Murder in a Cab. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 9. Richard Sullivan was a man who had never missed a train or failed to keep an appointment. On the morning after Reynard's dinner party, he strode purposefully down Broadway from City Hall. It was New Year's Day, and the bustling street was eerily empty. As he turned onto Wall Street, the clock in the Trinity steeple indicated 3 minutes to 9. The financier checked his watch and confirmed that the clock in the old belfry was accurate, prompting him to quicken his pace. Wall Street lay in serene silence, like a battlefield after the clamor of guns has subsided, leaving only shadows of those who had fought. The stillness enveloped him, almost suffocating. Finally, as Sullivan arrived at the Knickerbocker Bank, the belfry clock chimed the hour. The reporter was not there. Frustration bubbled up in Sullivan, and he scanned the street for any sign of Quentin. It was deserted. He decided to give Quentin 5 minutes of grace, and began to pace in front of the bank's entrance. Then an idea hit him. There was another entrance on Exchange Place, typically used by the bank's employees and officials. Maybe the reporter was waiting there. Sullivan made his way to Exchange Place and peered up the street. He spotted a man bent low over the curb in the gutter. Approaching closer, he recognized Quentin. The reporter, engrossed in his task, hadn't noticed him, clutching a magnifying glass as he examined the smooth-worn curb with intense focus. "Good morning, Mr. Quentin," the banker called out. "Have you lost something?" Quentin looked up calmly. "No, Mr. Sullivan. I've found something that might just be a hyphen." "A hyphen?" The banker raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "A hyphen that connects two parts of a very intriguing little puzzle." Sullivan squinted at the curb, confused. "I don't see anything there," he replied. Quentin held out the magnifying glass. "Take another look." He indicated a specific spot on the curb. Sullivan looked in the direction Quentin pointed. "I see some dried mud, dust particles, and a dark spot," he replied. "Yes," Quentin said, "that dark spot is the hyphen. There were likely others like it on the sidewalk yesterday afternoon, but they've been covered up by foot traffic. Here, however, are some that have remained." As he spoke, he guided Sullivan to the Exchange Place entrance of the bank, indicating several similar spots on the stone steps. "Fortunately," he remarked, mostly to himself, "the detectives came in through the front door last night. They didn't disturb this section of the trail." "But what are these spots?" the banker asked. "They're bloodstains," the reporter replied. "I'm convinced they're human blood. I can confirm that once we're inside the bank, as I've brought a powerful microscope. Shall we head in now? I've seen all I can outside. By the way, do you recognize this key?" He held up a large, intricately designed steel key. "Wow!" Sullivan exclaimed, surprised. "That looks like the key to the Exchange Place door. Where did you find it?" "In the gutter, near the sewer opening at the corner." "But how did it end up there?" Sullivan asked, concern evident in his voice. "I might be able to answer that soon," Quentin replied. "Shall we go in?" "No, not that way. Let's enter from the Wall Street side, if you don't mind." A couple of minutes later, the outer door of the Knickerbocker Bank was unlocked. "Excuse me for going in first," Quentin said as he stepped inside. "I want to check something here." He bent down over the tiled entrance, holding a magnifying glass. "It's unfortunate," he muttered to himself after a moment. "They've trampled all over the trail here. Ah, what's this?" "What?" Sullivan asked. The reporter didn't respond to the question, but asked another instead. "Is Thursday a general cleaning day at the bank?" "Yes," the banker replied. "Every evening after we close, we sweep the floors and dust the desks. But Mondays and Thursdays are set aside for washing the windows, scrubbing the floors, and so on." "Then it's fortunate that yesterday was Thursday," Quentin remarked. "Could you please hand me the key to this gate and the one for the inner door?" Once inside the bank, Quentin instructed his companion to sit in a specific chair. He then began to thoroughly examine the premises. He inspected the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling, sometimes using just his eyes and other times with a magnifying glass. He also frequently pulled out a tape measure and several times asked Sullivan for help when the distances were too far for him to manage alone. The Wall Street entrance of the Knickerbocker Bank led directly into the area where the public was welcomed. This area was, as usual, separated from the bookkeepers' and cashiers' sections. At the far end, a door opened into a reception room that connected to the president's office. The office itself had doors leading into the cashier's department on one side and a small room for the president's secretary and typewriter on the other, as well as an entrance to the vestibule of the exchange place entry to the bank. To the right of the vestibule was a large room where the bank employees kept their outerwear and could relax when off duty. One door from the clerk's room led into the cashier's department, while another opened into the private secretary's room. After finishing his inspection of the public area, Quentin, with Sullivan following, moved into the president's reception room, then into the other rooms, and finally into the cashier's and bookkeeper's departments. Several times he paused, retraced his steps to a specific spot, and then began his search again. At times he crawled on his hands and knees. At other moments he climbed onto the furniture, eager to examine a spot on the wall more closely. In the president's office, he paused to gather numerous tiny scraps of paper scattered in and around the wastebasket. He carefully placed them in an envelope and set it on the president's desk. On one side of the room stood an impressive, intricately carved mantelpiece. The artistic beauty of the structure seemed to escape Quentin, but he derived considerable satisfaction from inspecting the large, tiled hearth. After removing his coat and cuffs, he plunged his hand into the grimy chimney, pulling out a handful of soot, which he scrutinized before discarding. He repeated this process several times until, with evident satisfaction, he found a small object that he carefully placed in an envelope. Following this, he washed his hands in the clerk's room and moved into the cashier's department. In one corner stood an open telephone closet, the receiver hanging down. The reporter picked it up, staring at it intensely. Quentin's examination of the bank must have taken over 2 hours. At first, Richard Sullivan watched with mild curiosity, balancing amusement with good-natured skepticism. However, as time dragged on, the banker grew impatient. When Quentin finally returned to the private office and laid out a random assortment of tiny scraps and shreds on a sheet of white paper, the banker could hardly hide his displeasure. "Well, Mr. Quentin," he said, "I trust you're almost finished with your investigation. My time is too precious to squander it like this." "I still need at least one more witness," the reporter replied, "and I'm afraid I'll have to ask for your help in finding them." "But," he quickly added, noticing Sullivan's impatient gesture, "I can assure you that the time you're lamenting hasn't been wasted." The financier didn't seem convinced by this claim. However, he reluctantly agreed to assist the reporter as best he could. "All right then," said Quentin. "First, do you have any firearms in the bank?" "Yes," Sullivan nodded. "The cashier has a small revolver in his desk, meant for defense against a sudden robbery." "Do you have a key to the desk?" "Yes," the banker replied. "Would you kindly check to see if the revolver is where it's supposed to be?" "It should be," said Sullivan, pulling a key from a ring in his pocket and leading the way to the cashier's department, Quentin following closely behind. "Here it is, right where it's supposed to be." He handed the weapon to the reporter, who examined it closely. "Exactly," Quentin said, satisfied. "This is what I've been looking for." "What do you mean?" Sullivan asked. "I mean this is the revolver that was fired twice last night at the Knickerbocker Bank. Look for yourself. 2 of the cartridges are empty, and it hasn't been cleaned since those shots were fired." "But who could have fired the gun at whom, and why?" Hold on," Quentin exclaimed with a grin. "Let's take it one step at a time. For now, if you'll come back to your private office, I'll attempt to piece together the bits of evidence I've managed to gather." Go ahead and take your seat in that armchair, if you'd like, while I arrange these pages. I should be ready to continue my tale in under 10 minutes. Sullivan felt tense and restless, but any hint of amusement or doubt had faded from his face. He accepted the armchair and watched as Quentin meticulously assembled the small pieces of paper he had gathered with great care. Once he finished this task, the reporter moved to the typewriter and typed a few lines on a fresh sheet. Next, he examined the tiny fragments and particles he had collected during his investigation under the microscope. After completing this, he leaned back in his chair and stared into space for what felt like an endless stretch of time to Sullivan. Finally, he turned his gaze toward the banker, who was struggling to mask his growing impatience. "I'm ready to continue now," Quentin said, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper, where he began to sketch with ruler and pencil. "At last!" exclaimed the banker. "Indeed, but first, as they say in charades, I have a question." "Another one," Sullivan groaned. "When do I get my turn?" "Just a couple more," Quentin replied, "and then your turn will come, no doubt about it." "All right then, ask your questions if you must," Sullivan said, settling back into his chair with a resigned sigh. Chapter 10. Quentin was still focused on his diagram, speaking without glancing away from his work. "Who else has a key to the drawer where this revolver is stored?" "The cashier has one, and the head bookkeeper has the other." "Are you referring to the bookkeeper at the desk, farthest to the right in the bookkeeping department?" "Yes," Sullivan replied. "That's Mr. Kennedy's desk. Do you know him?" "No. What did you say his name is?" The reporter looked up, ready to jot it down. "John W. Kennedy. A man just over 50, quite bald with a fringe of grey hair, wearing a heavy mustache and side whiskers. Yesterday afternoon, when I last saw him, he was in a pepper and salt business suit," Quentin said, writing the name in his notebook. Sullivan stared at the reporter, astonished. Quentin offered a slight smile. "I met him yesterday afternoon," he explained. "Oh, that explains it," the banker said. "But why didn't you know his name?" "He didn't tell me, and I only just learned he works at the Knickerbocker Bank. How long has he been with you?" "Almost 20 years. He's been the head bookkeeper for the last 5. "I assume you have complete confidence in his honesty?" the reporter asked, studying the diagram in front of him. "Of course. Such a position is only entrusted to someone with an excellent track record." "And yet," the reporter mused, "opportunity can sometimes make a thief." "True, but it's the responsibility of a bank president to minimize those opportunities," Sullivan replied, sounding rather self-important. "Absolutely," Quentin agreed. "And you do this by having the books examined periodically," the banker answered, rubbing his hands together in satisfaction. "I see," said the reporter, who had now completed his sketch. "Do the employees know when these examinations will take place?" "They have no idea that such examinations occur. Only the accountant and I are privy to this matter. The reviews of the books take place entirely at night, after the bank has closed its doors." "Have the books undergone a recent review?" Quentin asked, with casual indifference. "Yes, just last week." "And they were found to be in order, as always." "May I inquire by whom?" "By Murray and Scott, the expert accountants." "Was the review performed by Mr. Murray or Mr. Scott?" "By neither. For many years, one of them would handle the work personally. However, with their business growing as it has, they've been unable to attend to their clients directly. For the past 2 years, they have been sending us a trusted employee, Mr. Oliver, Thomas Oliver." "Right," said Quentin, seemingly lost in thought. A silence lingered for several moments as the reporter examined his assortment of small curiosities, while Sullivan tapped rhythmically on the desk. Soon, the reporter broke the silence again. "Do you know a young man around 5 feet 8 inches tall, with bright red hair and somewhat flashy clothing?" "That would be Thomas Oliver. You know him, then?" "Me? No, I've never heard of him before," Then how do you know about him? He was here recently. Yes, I mentioned he'd been here last week, but... No, I mean he was here yesterday afternoon, the reporter interjected. Not that I'm aware of, Sullivan said, sounding skeptical. I suspected as much, Quentin replied calmly, but he was here nonetheless. The banker looked confused. Now, there's another thing, Quentin continued. I noticed in the bookkeeping department a notice stating that starting January 2nd, which is tomorrow, a new bookkeeping system will be implemented. Would this system help uncover any irregularities that might be hidden in the books? Yes, it requires each bookkeeper to switch to a different set of books every month, but I don't quite follow the direction of your questions. You will see it soon enough. Have you checked the safes this morning? Yes, it was one of the first things I did after you let me move again. I looked at the cash safe. Ah, the cash safe, and its contents are untouched. Absolutely, the banker replied, beaming with satisfaction. But there's also a safe in the bookkeeper's department. That one holds nothing but the records, which really only hold value for us. You haven't looked inside this safe? Well, no, If you don't mind, I would like to take a look inside that safe. I assume you know the combination just like you do for the cash safe. Of course, the combinations change every Saturday, and I'm always informed of the new one. Then may I check the bookkeeper's safe? I have no objection to that, if you wish. Sullivan appeared taken aback by the reporter's request, but he stood up and headed to the bookkeeper's department. Quentin followed closely behind. As the reporter drew near the safe, he saw Sullivan closely examining the lock. Suddenly, Sullivan let out a gasp of surprise. What is it? Quentin asked. I don't get it, Sullivan replied. I can't open the safe. The lock seems fine, but... Maybe the combination has been changed. It seems it has, the banker conceded. But why would it change on a weekday without my knowledge? That's quite significant, isn't it? The reporter suggested. Significant? What do you mean? Sullivan exclaimed, suddenly alert. I mean that Kennedy was embezzling. I don't yet know how he was skimming from the bank, but a look at the records will surely uncover it. I'd recommend you, Mr. Sullivan, eager to get started, was impatient. But, he argued nervously, I swear the books were looked over last week. Yes, by Kennedy's accomplice. What, Oliver his accomplice? Sullivan exclaimed, shocked. Without a doubt, Oliver was involved, Quentin replied. As long as no one but his accomplice Oliver had access to his books, Kennedy felt completely safe. But when the announcement came yesterday that his books would be under someone else's care after the new year, he knew his time was up. The men returned to the president's office. Those are his exact words, the reporter continued. The ones he telegraphed to Oliver yesterday. You can see them if you hold this sheet of blotting paper, which I found on Kennedy's desk, up to that mirror. Sullivan, with a trembling hand, took the blotting paper and held it in front of the glass, examining the reflection closely. What do you see? Quentin asked. Not a thing, the banker replied immediately. What? The reporter exclaimed. You don't see any marks on the blotting paper? I mean, I don't see anything that makes any sense. The blotting paper has been used, so there are ink marks on it, but as far as I can tell, they don't connect in any meaningful way. To me, they seem entirely random. Take another careful look at the blotter from this angle, Quentin said, drawing an imaginary line in the air. Ignore any other marks that might cross these lines. Do you see anything now? The banker focused on the reflection in the mirror for a while before answering. If I let my imagination run wild, I can see a few separate letters. Will you dictate those to me while I write them down? Make sure to indicate whether they are uppercase or lowercase. Also, separate the lines and indicate whether the letters are close together or spaced apart. Very well, Sullivan replied, then went on to read the letters reflected on the blotter in the mirror. Once finished, Quentin handed him the paper where he had noted down the dictated letters. The result resembled what you see below. "Well," the banker said, "if you can make sense of that jumble, your imagination is certainly more vivid than mine." "It's not about imagination," Quentin responded. "Let's approach this methodically. Here's a telegram blank I took from a pad on Kennedy's desk. Compare its size with the outline of the marks on the blotter, and you'll see that the message would fit perfectly on this sheet. Furthermore, you'll likely agree that the first line of marks on the blotter probably indicates a date, the second, a name, the third, an address, the final one, a signature, and the lines in between likely contain the message itself. I'm willing to accept that much. No businessperson would write a telegram any other way." "Great. Now let me hold this blank so that the reflection of its vertical lines appears just above the image of the message. Remember, these lines divide the words of the message. Extend them in your mind and see how they separate the letters on the blotter. Would you mind holding these papers while I transcribe the results?" In just a few more minutes, the reporter had drawn several lines on his copy of the reflection in the mirror. "I don't see that you're any better off than before," Sullivan remarked, studying the outcome. "Just a moment. These vertical lines, as we established, divide the words of the message. There are 5 words in the first line, and only 2 on the last line before the signature, which means there are 12 words in the message. Now, let's consider the first word. Clearly, the G begins this word, since it's capitalized, and the flourish on the tail of the E indicates where the word ends. Notice the space between the G and the E. Have you ever taken the time to see how consistently different letters occupy space in a particular handwriting? Try it sometime. Count the characters you've written across several lines, treating spaces and punctuation marks as individual characters, and observe how closely the results match. Based on this, I can confidently say that the first word of the message is game, gave, give, or another 4-letter word starting with G, and ending with E. Now, let me fill in the rest of the message as I interpret it between the letters." Quentin wrote slowly and precisely for a few minutes. There, take a look at the outcome. The message now appeared as follows. Compare this with the original's reflection and see if you can now spot various isolated marks and incomplete letters, all of which correspond with the text I've written here. Sullivan made the comparison. "I must concede that your conclusions seem plausible now," he admitted begrudgingly. Quentin shrugged. "Let's call them plausible and move on. Oliver kept the appointment yesterday, but for some reason, Kennedy was delayed leaving the bank. Maybe the necessary arrangements for his escape took longer than he anticipated. Do you think he planned to run away? Why else would he have changed the combination of his safe, if not to give himself as much time as possible to reach a safer location before anyone could investigate the books?" Quentin replied. Oliver, growing impatient, ignored caution and headed to the bank to find out what was causing Kennedy's delay. He met Kennedy at the Wall Street door. The 2 men went back inside, with Kennedy setting down his satchel in the vestibule and leaving the outer door ajar, just as Quinlan discovered a few minutes later when he took the satchel. I believe it was at Oliver's request that the men came back. He wanted to use the telephone, and he did. "Your story is all connected, and it certainly has plenty of details," Sullivan said, sounding skeptical. "In fact, there are way too many details given the evidence we have so far." "All of those details are rooted in fact," Quentin replied. "What I've done so far has been relatively straightforward, mainly because luck has been on our side. It was cleaning day at the bank yesterday, so the floors were scrubbed sometime in the afternoon, before Kennedy was ready to leave and before Oliver arrived. Because of that, nearly every step both men took is faintly but clearly visible on the wet floors, which have now dried and preserved those impressions. The detectives wiped away part of this record last night, but they left enough traces for us to work with. If you want to crawl around on the ground like I did, you'll easily see these traces for yourself." "No, thank you," the banker replied. "I'd rather take your word for this piece of evidence." "Then I'll continue," Quentin said. The footprints show that Kennedy was at his desk while the cleaning was happening. We can confidently say that he started to leave the bank after 4:30. Otherwise, Oliver would have waited for him at the corner of South and Wall Streets, as he was instructed in the bookkeeper's telegram. First, he went over to the safe and locked it, changing the combination to ensure the lock couldn't be opened until he had a good head start. Then he headed to the clerk's room for his hat and coat, as well as the satchel he had packed with just a few essentials for his escape. He was about to leave through the Exchange Place door, but likely remembered that the Wall Street door was unlocked, and went back to secure it. Just as he was about to shut the outer door, Oliver showed up, and the two men stepped back inside, as we have already observed. The footprints narrate their tale completely, with the sequence made clear by how one footprint in one trail sometimes gets covered by another in a later trail. The two men walked back into the room where we find ourselves now. Their subsequent actions will be clearer if you refer to this diagram. Chapter 11. As he spoke, Quentin handed Sullivan the sheet of paper on which he had drawn a plan of the Knickerbocker Bank. From this point onward, he continued, I've indicated the different trails on the diagram. The dotted lines represent Kennedy's footprints, while the continuous lines show Oliver's trail. How can you tell them apart? Sullivan asked. It's not difficult at all, Quentin replied. The differences are quite obvious. I know Kennedy's foot because I've seen it, and I recognize Oliver from your description of him. Yes, I understand. But how could you describe him so accurately when you've never met him? I'll get to that in a moment, Quentin said, smiling. You must allow me to tell my story in my own way if you want it to make sense. Very well, the banker said, sounding a bit resigned. But wait, he exclaimed. You mentioned two sets of trails. What about this third set of lines, marked with alternating dots and dashes? They represent the tracks of a third individual who will come into play later. He hasn't received his cue yet, but since you brought him up, we can label him as X, the unknown variable in this equation, because I don't know his name yet. Now, let me see. Where was I? Your interruption made me lose my train of thought. Ah, yes, the men were in this room. Kennedy, nervous and agitated, paced back and forth like a caged animal. Oliver was calmer. It was warm inside the bank compared to the bitter cold outside. He took off his overcoat and draped it over the back of that chair in the corner. This is confirmed by the direction of the footsteps leading to the chair, and by a mark directly below the arm of the chair where the garment brushed against the wet floor. Oliver's carelessness came with heavy consequences. By chance, one of the pockets of his coat held an important letter that slipped out and fell to the floor, the address facing up. Here's the envelope itself, which I've managed to piece back together. You'll notice it's only dirty on the back, and there's a faint oblong mark on the floor near the chair where it landed. Oliver went to the telephone in the cashier's office and likely didn't see the letter drop. However, it caught Kennedy's eye, and you can imagine his shock when he saw it was addressed to his wife. Why would his accomplice be writing to her? Kennedy seemed unfazed by any sense of propriety, or perhaps he was already suspicious of Oliver as he picked up the envelope, tore it open, and read the letter that I've also pieced together for you. It's quite revealing. I understand why Kennedy lost his composure upon seeing it. You should read it yourself. Wait, Sullivan exclaimed after reading the letter. This declares his intention to take his own life. Exactly, yet Kennedy didn't go through with it. He probably never intended to, and in any case he didn't write that letter. Notice that it lacks a signature. The name is typewritten, just like the rest of the letter. Moreover, it wasn't written here, despite what the address might suggest. I've tried your typewriter, and although it's the same model as the one used for this letter, there are distinct differences in alignment and imperfections in the type. Furthermore, Quentin added thoughtfully, the letter itself shows clear signs that it couldn't have been written by Kennedy. Your bookkeeper had a weak, nervous, and excitable nature, as clearly evident from all his actions. Before a man reaches the point of taking his own life, he must endure a prolonged period of intense emotional turmoil, a level of distress that few could truly understand. If he loved his wife, knowing his actions would lead her into a world of grief and shame, He might have penned her a disjointed and panicked letter, or perhaps a heartfelt and remorseful one. But what we have here is a stark, clinical statement about a grave decision. This letter reflects a cold and calculating mind, devoid of ordinary human emotion. The man who wrote it wouldn't have reached out to his wife at all, or would have done so only for some selfish reason. From what I know of Kennedy, I doubt he could have crafted these words. "You believe Oliver wrote this letter," Sullivan said. "But what purpose would Oliver have had in writing it?" "No," Quentin replied. "I don't think Oliver wrote this. That's what's puzzling. I can't believe that if he understood the significance of its contents, he would have willingly left it within Kennedy's reach, even for a moment. Then who could have authored it, and why would he hand it to Oliver? To your second question, I suggest he probably wanted it mailed from the main post office at the same time Kennedy would be leaving the bank. As for the first, I can't provide a definitive answer yet, but you'll see there are clues that point to our mysterious figure, X, as the letter's author. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's return to our drama. When Kennedy read the letter, he clearly thought, as I do, that someone was deceiving him. He sensed that they intended to eliminate him in a more discreet manner than exile. In short, he believed, as someone remarked about a Turkish sultan, that he was to be suicided. He must have had strong reasons to suspect Oliver of betrayal, because he immediately concluded that his only chance for survival was to strike first. While the accountant was occupied with the telephone, Kennedy stood by the desk, mechanically tearing the letter to shreds as he plotted the accountant's death. He had brought his revolver with him. The moment he thought of it, his decision was made. He quietly crept up to the paying teller's window. From there, he had a clear view of the telephone booth, its door wide open. Oliver was directly in his sights as Kennedy raised the pistol and, without a word, pulled the trigger. Oliver was holding the telephone receiver to his ear at that moment, which saved his life. The bullet lodged in his left hand instead. I will show you the blood-stained receiver as evidence. When the bullet hit him, Oliver fell forward and struck his head against the corner of the telephone box, resulting in a small scalp wound. I found several bright red hairs, which clearly belonged to him. I also discovered bits of his clothing that snagged on a protruding nail as he fell, indicating his preference for flamboyant attire. He managed to recover before Kennedy could fire again and dashed into the clerk's room, likely trying to escape through the door to exchange place. Just then, Kennedy burst through the reception area and this office, reaching the vestibule just in time to intercept Oliver, who then diverted and ran through the secretary's room, with Kennedy hot on his heels. Meanwhile, X, the person I mentioned earlier, was waiting in Exchange Place, where Oliver had a cab parked. Upon hearing the gunshot, he quickly rushed to help the accountant. He entered the office just in time to see Oliver dash in from the secretary's room, closely followed by Kennedy. X grabbed the chair in the corner and jumped between the fleeing man and his pursuer just as Kennedy raised his arm to shoot. Our mysterious friend must be quite strong. With one swing of the chair, he broke the bookkeeper's wrist. The gun fired, but thanks to the intervention, the bullet veered wildly. Instead of hitting its target, it struck Kennedy, piercing the upper lobe of his left lung and exiting at an angle of about 60 degrees. The bookkeeper had been standing not far from the mantel over there. Do you see that dark black line on the hearth? That was made by the bullet. Its trajectory allowed me to deduce immediately that it had ricocheted into the fireplace, and sure enough, I later found it in the soot that had collected in the bend of the chimney. Here it is. Sullivan listened to this account with clear interest. However, as Quentin's compelling narrative came to an end, he shook off the influence of those persuasive words, and a touch of skepticism returned. "Mr. Quentin, you've really missed your calling," he said, chuckling good-naturedly. "You should have been a playwright. You have a remarkable knack for presenting both facts and theories. While you're talking, it's hard not to believe every word you say. But now that you've wrapped up, I'm back to being a practical banker, and I have to point out a couple of facts that, in my view, could easily dismantle your elaborate theory." "Go ahead," Quentin replied. "It goes without saying that any theory must account for and explain every existing fact. If I've overlooked anything in this matter, which is entirely possible since I'm not claiming to be infallible, I would appreciate being informed. Naturally, if my conclusions don't align with the facts, then those conclusions must change, as facts are indisputable. All right then, Sullivan replied. Let's entertain the idea that these marks you've identified as trails were made by the feet of 3 different individuals. Even if we accept that one of these people was Kennedy, who often stays here after banking hours, I fail to see how you've provided any convincing evidence to support your claim that the other so-called trails belong to Oliver and an unknown person. For all I know, they could have been made by some of the bank employees just going about their regular duties. It's possible that Oliver's coat snagged on a nail in the telephone closet last week while he was here fulfilling his duties as an expert accountant. As for the change to the safe's combination, it might just be a mistake. We have no direct evidence that Kennedy has committed any wrongdoing. Then, regarding your detailed portrayal of the alleged shooting of Kennedy, it seems to me that you've let your enthusiasm take over. In your meticulous account of the bullet's trajectory at a specific angle that you seem to know down to the last detail, you overlook several critical points. 2 shots rang out yesterday at or near the Knickerbocker Bank. You claim there's a revolver with 2 empty cartridge casings, a black mark that could have resulted from a bullet ricochet, and a deformed piece of lead that might be evidence of that bullet. However, since one bullet can't explain 2 shots, you're left to conclude that Oliver must have taken the second one with him, presumably hidden in his hand. This is clever, very clever, but... His blood is on the telephone receiver, Quentin said quietly. Blood, Sullivan exclaimed. With the carnage you've painted here, there should be pools of it everywhere. We have a man running around with a wounded hand, leaving just a few drops on the telephone receiver and nowhere else. But then there's another man, shot through the lungs, through the upper lobe of his left lung, who doesn't seem to bleed at all. And where is he now? Such a wound, as you described, has to be fatal or at least serious. Yet here's a dead man, or at the very least a dying one, calmly walking away as if the curtain has fallen at the end of your play, and the corpse hurried off to its dressing room. You're forgetting something else, the reporter suggested with a smile. Sullivan looked at him, puzzled. Yes, you've overlooked the pistol that was put back in the drawer after Kennedy was shot, and the doors of the bank locked carefully. True, no, my dear sir. Your elaborate theory won't withstand even a moment's scrutiny. And yet, Quentin replied, my conclusions, as far as they go, are absolutely correct. Every objection you raise is reasonable enough if you take each one alone, but we're not dealing with isolated facts. We're looking at a series of connected events, each one relying on and supporting the others. Let me finish my story, and I believe you'll see that what seems like a fanciful notion to you now is, in fact, a straightforward explanation of plain, unembellished facts. Sullivan, with a dismissive gesture, settled back into his chair again. We left Kennedy shot through the left lung, as you just pointed out, probably fallen like a log, while Oliver, weak from shock, leaned against the doorframe over there. He must have pressed his wound with his free hand while he ran. I haven't been able to find any trace of blood between the telephone and this spot. However, there is a stain on the door jamb that hasn't been entirely wiped away, which allowed me to estimate Oliver's height. X was the only one of the 3 who seemed to know what he was doing at that moment. I truly admire X. He must possess remarkable nerve. Instead of panicking and fleeing from the scene, as any ordinary criminal would, he calmly took steps to secure his escape and methodically covered his tracks. His first move was to lock the Wall Street gate and the inside door. Quinlan had likely pulled the outer door shut as he ran away, so X probably assumed it was locked as well. Then, with Oliver's help, he assisted Kennedy, who was not yet dead and might have regained consciousness by then, into the cab waiting nearby on Exchange Place, where I found the blood stains on the curb, as you will recall. After sending off his 2 accomplices in the cab, he returned to the bank, put the pistol away in its designated spot, which he seemed to know well, and cleaned up most, if not all, of the blood stains. There was a sponge and bucket under the sink in the clerk's room that were used for this task. Once he believed he had erased all traces of the tragedy, he calmly exited through the Exchange Place entrance, locked the door, and tossed away the key. All of this took place while policeman Flynn was chasing Quinlan. You should note that X, unaware of the Quinlan situation, had every reason to think that the shots hadn't drawn any attention outside the bank. It's likely that he was unsettled by the return of the policeman and Quinlan. Otherwise, I can't explain why he left the gas burning. If he had had the time, I am confident that, with his usual attention to detail, he would have turned it off. As for my detailed account of Kennedy's injuries, there's really nothing out of the ordinary there. I'm certain that the weapon used by X was that chair over there, as I found bits of the bookkeeper's skin on one of its legs, which was quite loose from the impact. I know precisely what the injuries were because I've had a chance to examine them closely. I mentioned to you that I saw Kennedy yesterday. What? Sullivan exclaimed in disbelief. You mean after he was hurt? Yes, Quentin replied. His body is over at the morgue now. You could go there this afternoon to identify it if you'd like, but honestly, it might be better to keep that identification under wraps until we're further along in tracking down Oliver and our friend X. Chapter 12. Later that same evening, Quentin returned to his lodgings after a long day working on the Knickerbocker bank case. He felt exhausted and confused. Despite his tireless determination, sharp mind, and diligent efforts, he had hit a wall in his investigation. The Evening Tempest had come out without any updates on the Quinlan case and offered only a brief report on the cab mystery, with no attempt to link the two. Quentin refused to share his findings until he was confident he would achieve results. As he approached his home, he noticed a light in his window, realizing that someone was waiting for him inside. It was Mr. Sullivan, who looked pale and worn as he paced nervously back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back, his head bent down. Finally, there you are, the banker said eagerly. I've been waiting for over an hour. Is there new information? Quentin asked. Yes, here, read this. Sullivan handed him a letter. Let me explain first. After I left you this morning, I went to the morgue and saw the body. You were right. It is Kennedy. I was only half convinced by your evidence before, but seeing the body made me realize you were likely correct in all your other conclusions as well. I became anxious to find out more about the extent of Kennedy's embezzlement. Since I couldn't access the books right away, I paid a visit to Mrs. Kennedy, hoping she could provide some insight. You didn't see her, did you? No, Quentin replied gravely. I didn't think she would know much more about this than we do, and I dreaded the thought of telling her about her husband's crime and tragic death. I wanted to make sure I explored every other option for gathering information before turning to this one. Of course, said Sullivan, a bit impatiently. The woman deserves our sympathy. Still, I can't let any sentimental feelings interfere with my duty to our depositors. What did you find out from her? The reporter asked. When I arrived at the house, the maid told me that Mrs. Kennedy had spent the previous evening at her sister's place in the country and hadn't returned yet. I was just about to leave, planning to come back later in the evening when the lady herself came through the door. Upon discovering who I was, she looked a bit surprised, but invited me inside. As we entered the parlor, the maid handed her a letter, saying it had come in the morning mail. Mrs. Kennedy glanced at the envelope but didn't open it. When I asked my first careful questions, she appeared quite taken aback. Kennedy had sent her a telegram the day before, saying he needed to leave town for a few days on business. He led her to believe he would return soon and that his business was related to the bank's operations. She couldn't understand how I knew nothing about his trip. But, she said, I've just received a letter from him, which will surely explain everything. It was clear she was unaware of her husband's wrongdoing. With that, she opened the envelope and took out the letter. I watched her closely. At the first words, I saw her face lose color and a look of anguish cross her features as she instinctively pressed her hand to her heart. In that moment, I knew the letter contained something significant, and I became eager to get my hands on it. Once she finished reading, I noticed the weight of strong emotions bearing down on her, yet she maintained her composure, carefully folded the letter back into its envelope, and simply said, "This doesn't tell me where my husband is, but I'm sure I'll hear more about him in a few days. I realized she was trying to protect him with the hope that he was still alive. With that in mind, I gently broke the news of his death to her. The initial shock seemed to entirely unnerve her, but after a while she regained some calm. "In the end, it's for the best," she finally said. Then she handed me the letter, as if there was no reason to keep it any longer. "Read it now." "It has a postmark from the General Post Office at 5 o'clock, Quentin said. "So it was mailed either before or during Oliver's visit to the bank. It could have been sent by Kennedy before the cleaning was finished, or maybe by the choirwoman when she left the bank." The reporter took out the letter from its envelope and began to read. "The Knickerbocker Bank, New York, December 31, 1896. My beloved wife. When you read this letter, I will be far away, a disgraced criminal, and you will be worse than a widow. I cannot ask for your forgiveness for the trouble I am causing you, as I fully understand the depth of the pain I have inflicted. Yet, I feel compelled to lay bare the circumstances that led to my downfall, as I do with my own conscience. Knowing these details may help you grasp, at least a little, the temptation I succumbed to, though even now it is hard for me to comprehend how I gave in. Perhaps you remember the celebration of my 50th anniversary. We were enjoying a wonderful evening with the friends you invited to share in the festivities when a visitor was announced. I had to excuse myself from our guests to meet with him in the library. This man wasted no time explaining why he was there. His name was Thomas Oliver, an expert accountant who had been hired by the Knickerbocker Bank to review the books. He calmly informed me that he had just uncovered a significant error that allowed a depositor to overdraw his account by a considerable amount. At first, I struggled to accept what he said, even as he provided copies from the books that clearly illustrated how the mistake occurred. When he suggested that it was up to me to decide whether the error would be reported to the bank, I indignantly refused to entertain the notion. Throughout our meeting, he remained completely composed, and eventually left me with the assertion that he would wait 24 hours before submitting his report to the bank president. The next day, my first task upon arriving at the bank was to verify Oliver's claims. Unfortunately, they were painfully true. The glaring error was right in front of me. I couldn't comprehend how I had made such a mistake. It was simply there, undeniable. I had held on to hope until that moment, but now I realized I was facing ruin. I saw only one honorable course, to openly admit my fault and accept the consequences, whatever they might be. Yet, I hesitated, and in doing so, I felt I was in peril. I hesitated because I feared for my position. Would the bank's officers really understand? In my own eyes, I found no justification for my error. At 50 years old, the thought of starting over from the bottom of the ladder I had worked so hard to climb was daunting. Finding another job wouldn't be easy. The more I pondered the situation, the more I began to believe that perhaps there was another way to resolve my predicament. Could it be that the depositor who benefited from my mistake had done so without any ill intent? If that was the case, perhaps he would be willing to pay back the amount I had overdrawn. At the very least, if he refused, couldn't I find a way to gather and borrow enough to cover the shortfall? This would allow me to fix my error without anyone finding out. But what about that man, Oliver? Wouldn't his report expose me? I remembered his hint that the outcome of his report depended on me. What could he mean by that? He was likely to demand a price for his silence. This would increase the sum I needed to raise significantly, but wouldn't it be better than losing my job? Either way, there was no harm in hearing his offer, whatever it might be. That afternoon, right after the bank closed, I visited the address Oliver had provided. He seemed to be expecting me. Alongside him was a man he introduced as James Withers, the depositor who had benefited from my blunder. If I hadn't been so anxious, I might have questioned the oddity of Withers being in Oliver's room. Both men greeted me warmly, and even before I had a chance to bring up the matter, Withers expressed his regret about the error and assured me that he was willing to reimburse the bank. But there was an unsettling but. He was currently short on cash. All his funds were tied up in a venture that he claimed would yield impressive profits in just a few days, if only he could arrange a few $100s to tide him over a little longer. Without that small amount, everything would be lost. Insidiously and relentlessly, they pushed me toward the trap they had set, and I was too weak to resist. By the end of our meeting, I had agreed to let Withers further overdraw his account, and he had given me his solemn promise to repay the entire amount he owed the bank by the end of the week. Then Oliver suggested it would be wiser for the second overdraft to come from another account. Withers went along with him, suggesting that the check could be written in the name of Henry Everett, a relative of his who had recently opened a small account with the Knickerbocker Bank. I strongly resisted involving anyone else in my shameful secret. However, I eventually let myself be persuaded by the smooth-talking con men who had ensnared me. The following day, I took my first step into crime, making the necessary entries to ensure Everett's check would be honored. After that, I was completely under the control of those two men. It didn't take long for me to realize I had been duped. Oliver's accomplice wasn't the real Withers. Just a few days later, the true Withers made a sizable deposit that more than covered his earlier overdraft. The impostor was Henry Everett himself. Once I had committed the crime, there was no need for Everett to keep pretending he wanted to repay the money I had helped him steal. I was now entangled in this web of crime just as deeply as my accomplices, and from that moment on, they forced me to be their pawn. Over the past 2 years, I have witnessed the bank being robbed of over $250,000, all of which has lined the pockets of Oliver and Everett. You can probably imagine the hell my life has turned into during this time. With the threat of prison and disgrace looming over me, and a firm belief that exposure was inevitable, I have endured the tortures of the damned. At the bank, I have been stuck in a constant state of anxiety. I've flinched at every word directed at me, sensed distrust in every glance that met mine, and I have trembled at each approach of any bank officer. Yet, I have not dared to step away from my desk for even an hour, terrified that an inspection of my books in my absence would expose my wrongdoing. I've arrived at the bank first thing in the morning and been the last to clock out at night. I've even skipped the few minutes it would take to grab a quick meal. For 2 years, I've managed to avoid my annual vacation on one pretext or another. I've dragged myself to work while feeling so sick I could hardly stand, simply because I couldn't risk letting anyone else handle my books for even a moment. All the while, fully aware of my disgrace and infamy, I've been forced to keep up my deceptions, knowing each one drew me closer to the inevitable exposure. But I also understood that refusing to continue my thefts would lead to instant betrayal by my accomplices. Then the moment came when further concealment was no longer an option. Just a week ago, the annual audit took place. The expert accountant, as always, was Thomas Oliver, and his report was completely satisfactory. It seemed, for a time, that I could postpone discovery a little longer. Then suddenly, this morning, we were informed of a new bookkeeping system set to start after the 1st of January. I knew right away that it was over. The revelation of my crime was now just hours away. I had to get out before it all came crashing down, or I was finished. I can already picture the prison stripes on my back. The sound of the heavy gates echoes in my mind. I'm too stunned to think clearly, yet I sense that my only way out is through death. Still, I cling to life. I know the happy days we shared are lost forever, and yet I feel a strange sort of numb relief in knowing that the worst is now inevitable, and it will come soon. I have carefully planned my escape, ensuring I'll have enough time to reach a safe place. Once I'm there, I'll be free from pursuit, but I'll be a wanderer, carrying the weight of my sins with me to the grave. The sharpest pain in my remorse comes from thinking about the great wrong I've done to you, my dear wife. You'll now have to face the world without the one who should have protected and cared for you. And worse, you'll bear the burden of my faults. I've moved what little money I had left in the savings account into your name. Use it freely. Every dollar was honestly earned by me. I swear I've never touched a single cent of the money I've taken unlawfully. It all came from Henry Everett, and I don't know how it was spent. As soon as I settle in my new location, I'll do everything in my power to make amends for my past, through hard work. I hope to be able to support you again in the not-so-distant future. Oh, my wife, my beloved, how I wish I could erase the past and once again hold your hand as an honest man. Though you may find it difficult to forgive me now, perhaps in time you will be able to remember kindly the man who, despite all his wrongdoing and downfall, has remained. Your devoted husband, John W. ARBOJSD. My safety relies on your keeping this letter confidential for at least 3 days. After that, please send the enclosed papers to Mr. Sullivan, president of the Knickerbocker Bank. They will reveal to him the full extent of my embezzlement. I have no qualms about betraying Oliver and Everett. They showed no hesitation in ruining me. I have sent for Oliver and will inform him of my intended escape. If he sees fit, he may take whatever actions he deems necessary to evade the punishment he so richly deserves. While Quentin read Kennedy's letter, Sullivan paced the room with restless energy, observing him closely. "Well," he asked, stopping in front of the reporter, "what do you think of that?" "Poor woman," Quentin replied, feelingly. "It's heartbreaking to consider the suffering her husband's actions have caused her. I should be more accustomed to situations like this, since it seems to be the inevitable consequence of almost every crime. Yet, I find myself moved every time by how the innocent must pay for the sins of the guilty." Yes, I understand," Sullivan said dismissively. "That's not what I meant. Did you notice how much this scoundrel admits he and his partners have stolen from the bank?" "Yes, it's a significant amount. $250,000. If that's accurate, it could cripple the bank. No, that's not what I meant, of course. The bank is wealthy and could withstand the loss of 4 times that amount. But still, $250,000 is a substantial sum. It's hard to believe that, despite all our precautions, they managed to take away so much money. Yet they did. There's no doubt about it. In the papers that Kennedy sent along with his letter to his wife, he explains exactly how it all happened. It's simple enough once you know the trick, but it took a clever mind to come up with it. I never would have guessed that that scheming bookkeeper could be sharp enough to pull off such a plan. "If this scheme is truly brilliant," Quentin said, "you can be sure that X, likely Henry Everett, came up with it." "Well, regardless," Sullivan remarked, "there's one thing we need to do right away. We have to locate both Oliver and Everett. There's no way these men have together spent $250,000 in just 2 years." "While it's possible, it's just as likely they haven't," Quentin replied. "My investigations show that both Kennedy and Oliver lived regular, respectable lives. They don't seem to have been living beyond their means at all. There's no indication that either of them led a double life that could explain the situation. Neither one was a reckless spender or a gambler, nor did they engage in any form of debauchery. Then you have no idea where Oliver or his mysterious partner might be. Let me outline what I've done so far, and then you can assess the situation for yourself. It'll also help me clarify my thoughts, as organizing one's ideas into words often leads to clearer thinking.